about Subhash Chandra Bose, Mr. Sanyal? The criticism against him is that he chose to collaborate with two extremely brutal regimes. One, the German, the other, the autocratic Japanese, regimes. While he is undoubtedly an icon of the freedom movement, his strategy was misplaced and flawed, is what many people say. How do you see this?
Well, it depends on how you see the Allies on the Axis. The Western narrative, which sometimes is imbibed here, is that the Second World War is a war between forces of good and evil. The other way of thinking about it is quite different, particularly from the Indian perspective. After all, the Allies were in occupation of India. We should see the likes of Netaji as the resistance. After all, in France, the resistance is seen against the Nazis are seen as fighting, having a fair sort of a reason to fight against the Germans. The exact same thing was true of Netaji. After all, Netaji didn't like Nazism. In fact, he writes in his own writings. And in fact, he went to Hitler and in fact made his case against racism. So it's not that he was in favor of it. But to say that because he allied with them, he was also a Nazi is crazy. Because after all, Churchill and Roosevelt allied with Stalin. Was Roosevelt a communist? Should you blame the Americans for all the Stalinist purges and the millions of people who died there? Nobody in their sane mind would do that. So why should you have that view about Netaji at all? Netaji clearly was uncomfortable with Nazism, but I think quite correctly, he saw the Second World War as a war between two sets of evil empires, which they were. Do remember that the British carried out a scorched earth policy in Bengal, from where Netaji comes from, during the Second World War, deliberately killing 3 million people. 3 million Bengalis died in 1943 in the Great Bengal Famine. And it was man-made famine. So, there is very little to distinguish from an Indian perspective, particularly a Bengali perspective, between Churchill and Hitler. So, Netaji, I think, took the call that, look, what I'm here to do is to free my people from this entirely evil empire. And he took his chances.
And how much did the role of the INA and the coverage of the Red Fort trials of INA soldiers and eventually the naval mutiny compel the British to realize that their days in India were numbered?
Well, certainly was a very, very important reason why we got our freedom. And to again appreciate that, you have to appreciate what the situation is after the Second World War ends. The Indian Army was in occupation of large parts of the world because the British, Australian, and Americans, they were all going home. They were getting demobilized, and these soldiers wanted to go back home to their families, to their jobs, and so on. And so much of the world that had fallen in Allied control was actually occupied by British Indian soldiers. This is true in Egypt. It was true in what is now Indonesia, southern Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma. All these areas, a huge swath of the world is occupied by the British Indian Army. But the problem is, there are obviously freedom movements all over there, and many of them require actual brutal suppression. In Indonesia, there were massive battles between the Indonesian nationalists and the British Indian forces, and many hundreds of Indian soldiers died for it. So you can imagine there was a lot of grumbling. Hello, why are we getting killed for some, not even the British Empire. This is for the Dutch that we are dying. Why would we want to do that? So the British Indian Army was on the verge of mutiny. And if they had indeed revolted, it would have really messed things up. So this is the context in which the INA trials happen. The British completely miscalculate about the impact it has on the British Indian forces scattered everywhere. And then, of course, the naval revolt of 1946. So this is the context in which the British very quickly realize that this army is going to revolt on us. And, we will completely lose control of the situation. And it's in the middle of the naval revolt of 1946 that the Cabinet Committee on Indian Independence is announced by Attlee. It's not a coincidence.